Welcome to this edition of Dufferin Life. I'm your host, Teena Avery. Thank you so much for joining us. So we have a familiar face, but she hasn't been on in a while, and I want to introduce you to Sonya McDonald. She is with the Edify Centre, co-owner, team leader, so many titles. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, let's start off for anyone who doesn't know, because a lot of what I do is creating awareness and making people aware of things that they might not know about. So let's talk about what the Edify Centre does.
Okay. We run a mental health education centre here in Orangeville. We do mental health education workshops. We do lots of suicide awareness, suicide intervention, some mental health pieces, things like self-injury, addiction, those kinds of things. Okay. We also do one-on-one counseling. We have a team of 4 counselors on site. And we also run a pretty amazing therapeutic boxing program. And all 3 together have just really created a really amazing center.
And you're in a new location.
Yes. We had a little bit of a struggle getting there, but we're there. We're so happy to be now at the top end of Broadway. Our gym space has tripled in size. We now have 4 counseling spaces where we only had 2 before. And one of them was my office. So, it was, it's definitely a change. We love it. And
it's a great location. I was there for the grand opening, and it is phenomenal. So I encourage you to check it out at edifycentre.ca. And that's EDIFY, Centre, CENTRE.ca, just to make sure you're getting to the right place. So I brought you here because I'm excited about what you do. I love what you do, and I love to promote it. But you had a very interesting trip to some remote parts of Northern Ontario.
I did.
And I want you to tell me a little bit about, let's start with where you went and why you went there.
Okay. So this is the second time I've been to Northern Ontario. I grew up in what I called Northern Ontario, which is North Bay. I went way past North Bay. I actually flew into Winnipeg. So it was the first time I had ever been kind of to that end. We went on a 2-week training opportunity. One of my colleagues there runs a business, Northern Horizons, and she does assist training as well. So she does the same trainings that I do. And so she hired me to come, and we went into 2 First Nations communities. One, Couchiching First Nations is in Fort Francis, which is pretty much on the border. And it was an amazing training. And then we flew in on a charter to, I will butcher the name, but Ibamagoon, I want to say. We call it Fort Hope First Nations. It is a remote community. It's about 345 kilometers from Thunder Bay.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were number one, you were very far out, and I'm assuming this year very cold.
Yes. So when I called home, the coldest temperature I think was minus 41. We were fully geared, and I think the warmest day we had was around minus 24. And when we were driving through Sioux Lookout, which is where we stayed, was kind of our home base, people were wearing hoodies, and I was fully geared in my toque, and
Well, that's awesome. So let's talk about the type of training that you did there, because I think it's really important.
So I did assist training, which is applied suicide intervention skills training. So it's a 2-day training. It's recognized worldwide. It's the gold standard worldwide. We essentially teach people how to have a conversation about suicide and do some safety planning with someone. So we did that, and then in each community we did 3 days. So we did the assist, which is 2, and then the 3rd day was the ask training, which is assessing for suicide in kids. So it was amazing.
And it's so important, and this is why you've been on the show before, and why we talk about it is suicide awareness. It's not always something that we want to talk about. It's not always something that we're comfortable talking about, but it's so important to talk about because it's all about prevention.
Yeah. I say to people a lot, I know suicide is not dinner conversation at your house. At my house, yes, but not at most people's homes, and I get that. I think a big part of why I love this training so much and why I do the work that I do is that prevention piece. And I love that we can offer some things around prevention, but we can also offer the intervention piece. And one of the best things about that training is that it's designed for everyone. You don't have to be a clinician or a counselor or psychologists. You don't have to work in the mental health field to take this training. You could help save your neighbor's life. You could help save anyone's life. So that's why I'm really super passionate about doing those trainings.
Absolutely, because we all see people around us that, oh, so-and-so might just be having a bad day, or, you know what, they're a little down on their luck right now, and, these things happen, and, I'm not going to approach that person, because you think that you're doing them a favor by not bringing it up and making them speak about it.
And what we know about people who have thoughts of suicide is that they just want someone to ask them about it. They really do want to talk about it. It's just really uncomfortable. As uncomfortable as it is for us to recognize it, it's as uncomfortable for the person having thoughts to talk about it. So if we make it easier for them to do that, then the likelihood of them staying alive is much higher.
Right.
And I say all the time, having thoughts of suicide is completely natural. It's something we all do at some point in our life. And suicide isn't really about wanting to die, it's about struggling to live.
Right.
Trying to figure out how to get to tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think the more and more we have these conversations, the more it becomes less awkward to talk about it. Not necessarily less awkward to approach somebody, because I think no matter what, having the knowledge makes you more comfortable. So, but we need to talk about these things.
And it's really okay to talk about it. And the more we talk about it, the more comfortable people will be reaching out for help. We can never expect that someone who's in that really awful, dark place to reach out for help on their own. So as a community, I think we need to do that work. And it's interesting that every community sees suicide differently. And even just in my recent experience going between Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario, there are some distinct differences. The language barriers that are in the north are very different than they are here. We are also much more likely in the south to ignore people, like you said, not ignore them in a bad way, but maybe avoid that topic of suicide, not wanting to be nosy, right?
Right, yeah.
And in a First Nations community, it's really different. The community I was in Fort Hope had lost 2 young people the week before to suicide, and almost everyone in the room was either related to that person or knew that person.
And there's such small communities. Yeah. So what was that experience like for you? I know that you were out there teaching everybody. Yeah. What did you learn from these experiences?
Interesting that I really learned, even though I have an Indigenous background, but I really learned the harsh realities of the difference between the North and South. And I hate to say white privilege is a thing. You don't want to think it is, but one of the things that I really learned and that really was powerful for me was that we think we know here. I'm saying people in the South. We think that we know about residential schools. We know about the trauma. We hear what the media tells us. But when you're sitting in a room with residential school survivors who are telling you the atrocities of how they were removed from their communities and how they survived it and how many people they've lost, we just don't really know.
I know, it's we try to talk about it more and more because it's about creating that awareness. Yeah. We talk about, learning Indigenous culture so that we can better, our understanding of what's going on. And, I've had people on here talking about that as well. It's all about the give and take of learning a little bit more, because it's not, those atrocities were not something we were taught in history.
No. And people will say things like, well, that's intergenerational. Don't forget, residential schools, we're first generation. I was in a room in the last week with 7 people who survived being removed from their community and survived residential school. So, and they weren't much older than my parents. Right? So it is first generation. And the level of trauma in those communities is very high. So the rates of suicide are very, very high. And we know that, but sometimes to those communities, they feel like statistics.
Right.
Just because their rate of suicide is really high, yes, we need to throw resources, and yes, we need to go and help it and support them, but we need to support them in a way that's going to make sense for them.
Yes.
And sometimes we forget that.
Yeah, I think there's certain things that not take for granted, because that's not the right word, but there's certain things that we assume, or certain things that that you assume, and you hear things about what's happening out in the world, and we're talking about suicide, and you think, I like to think that I try to make myself as knowledgeable as possible, but I don't even know a fraction of what I need to know.
Yeah, I don't think any of us do. I think until you've lived it, I don't think we really know. We also know that everyone has a different reason for wanting to end their life. And so what's meaningful to you might not be meaningful to me. Or how you manage something in your life, I might manage really differently, and we don't necessarily always recognize that in each other.
Right.
And then you go to a community where they've been impacted at such a deep level. I mean, their kids are dying of suicide, their brothers, their spouses, and it's a conversation that's happening. The difficult part in going in and doing training is that not just the language barrier, but the barrier of that community culture not wanting to talk about it.
Right.
The fear of, if I talk about it, they're going to do it. And that is, we know that it's a myth. We know the research tells us that. We know from talking to survivors that tells us that. But we all carry that with us, no matter what. It's hard.
I mean, the entire mental health, I was going to say industry, but the entire community, the country, the people, everyone in the world, there's a stigma to mental health, and then there's a bigger stigma to things like suicide and talking about it, or people who may have been raped. People, there's a stigma of you hide that, you don't bring that out to people.
Absolutely.
And if they don't, unfortunately, they don't have that opportunity to tell their story, to get the healing from telling their story, and then moving forward to find further healing.
Yeah. One of the other things I really learned when I was there was allowing people to tell their story. That's something that we teach in our training, and that's all part of the language that we use, is allow people to tell you their story, because it's really meaningful to them and important to them. But in the Indigenous community, telling your story means a whole other thing, right?
Okay.
Sharing your story is very different in that community. It sounds the same, but it is far more meaningful to them, and you carry that story for someone. Right? As a helper, you carry it for them, you help them lift, we call it the emotional backpack, we help lift that backpack for them.
Sonya, I want to thank you so much. We could talk about this for a while, but thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll have you back really soon.
Great, thanks.
Wonderful. Don't you go anywhere, we'll be right back. So then we're still on screen, so we're going to go.